Hi, I'm Robert McGill. I'm a professor of English at the University of Toronto. I'm also a novelist, a story writer, occasionally even the author of a poem or two. Last year, I was a faculty research fellow at the Jackman Humanities Institute, and my talk today follows on from work I did during my fellowship. It's about speculative style, creative writing as research. I've previously been the director of the university's creative writing MA program. Well, actually, more accurately, it's the MA program in English in the field of creative writing. Obviously, we named it before the tariff on prepositions came in. I mention this background because much of my current research, not least my work on style, is animated by the question of what creative writing's place at universities should be. In 1975, there were only 3 American universities offering bachelor's degrees in creative writing. As of 2017, there were 733, and that's to say nothing of the hundreds of graduate programs. These programs continue to be popular even as humanities enrollments more generally have dipped. And I think one reason for that popularity has to do with our student self-conceptions. At a time when technology's made it easier than ever before for a person to share their creative work with the world, our students have grown up thinking of themselves as creators. Many of them just aren't interested in only watching videos or reading fiction. They also want to be making those things. Now, I'd like to debunk a couple of canards about creative writing at the university. I know that debunking canards might sound like a mixed metaphor, but it's not if you picture just shooing ducks from a bed, which I encourage you to do. It's actually quite sweet to imagine. One of these canards is the old line that creative writing can't be taught. Now, it's true that not every student can be transformed into the next Alice Munro, but then you could also say that not every chemistry student can be turned into another Marie Curie. In terms of what we do in the creative writing classroom with students, we help them to appreciate and practice the skills involved in writing well. We show them how creative texts are put together. We discuss the innovations that have happened in literature. We teach best practices in terms of drafting and revising. We also introduce our students to key issues in the field, from developments in publishing to matters of literary ethics. Creative writing has also developed a distinctive pedagogical method, and that method is the workshop. The workshop's a format in which everyone, instructors and students together, discuss their responses to the students' writing one story or poem at a time. In that respect, another canard about creative writing is that the workshop cultivates in students peer feedback, a mixture of, empty praise and jealous takedowns. Things such as, I like your use of semicolons, they really make you think. Or maybe conversely, the main thing I liked was your use of semicolons. In fact, in a good workshop, students learn to offer feedback that's rigorous and that's also supportive. They learn, really importantly, an open-mindedness about what in a piece of writing counts as success. In the way of all good editors, they learn to imagine themselves into the minds of the author, to figure out what the person was trying to achieve, and then they imagine how the author might better achieve it. They also learn how to take on board others' feedback judiciously, and they develop a greater objectivity about their own work. Meanwhile, we teach our students the same sorts of skills that we teach in other English courses: how to analyze and interpret texts, critical thinking about narratives and representations, the mastery of rhetoric, and yes, the proper use of semicolons. Good creative writing teachers also encourage their students to innovate. In the creative writing classroom, I think the eternal adversaries are stereotype and cliche. Well, also people forgetting to number their pages, but I've learned to live with that. We all know how many formulaic novels have been published, how many movies there are out there that have 9-figure budgets and $5 scripts. So in the classroom, we steer students toward the individuated, toward the complicated. And as we do this, we're helping to make them not just better writers and thinkers, but better citizens, better able to recognize and reject stereotypes and cliches, more liable to embrace diversity and complexity, not only in writing, but also out in the world. Now, so far I've been talking about the teaching of creative writing. I also want to talk about universities supporting creative writing by faculty members. At the U of T's St. George Department of English, I can count among my colleagues who write creatively and teach creative writing such stars as Claire Battershill, Randy Boyagoda, George Eliot Clark, Larissa Lai, Noor Nugga, and Ian Williams. Frankly, it's a little intimidating. These are all people doing tremendous work both on the page and in the classroom. But the legend of the historical relationship between universities and their creative writing faculty is actually one of mutual distrust. When it was proposed long ago at Harvard that the novelist Vladimir Nabokov be hired to teach there, one professor there famously declared, "What's next? Shall we appoint elephants to teach zoology?" That anecdote, by the way, can be found in a book called The Elephants Teach. Well, in fact, I'd say that creative writing faculty are often model university faculty in certain ways. For one thing, they're public-facing in their research. Most creative writers and the books they publish are looking to reach a wider audience than just fellow specialists, fellow scholars, as all of my colleagues have done. Now, I've just referred to creative writing as research. That idea might strike some people as strange. Sure, you might say a historical novel that brings to light new information from some archive, that might count as research. But, what about the colleague who's just published a short story about, say, an endocrinologist who gets reincarnated as a chimp? It's a great story, by the way. The link is below. You should all read it. Well, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, for its part, recognizes that creative writing can be a kind of scholarly research, what the council calls research creation. What does that mean in terms of creative writing? What does it mean, you might ask, in terms of fiction, given that fiction isn't committed to telling the literal truth? Well, there are quite a few things that fiction and other creative writing don't only accomplish, but I'd say accomplish uniquely well as research. That is, as work that advances our understanding of the world. This is something I've written about in an article that was published last year in the Writer's Chronicle. The article's paywalled, but I'll, again, put the link below. One of the ways in which creative writing creates knowledge, helps advance our understanding, is when writers depict, in the novelist Henry Fielding's phrase, scenes of private life. Doing so in ways that, other researchers can't, given the ethical considerations involved, not to mention privacy laws. Fictionalization is really invaluable here as a kind of protective mask that lets private realities be more freely, more comprehensively represented and considered, from interpersonal relationships to unspoken thoughts and feelings. I can only guess what Henry's thinking here, but it's not good. Another way in which creative writing can be valuable as research is when it innovates in terms of forms, innovates in terms of genres, styles. When it does that, it creates new means of expression that become available to other authors and indeed to all of us. To give just one example, a Canadian author, William Gibson, was a key player in establishing the genre of cyberpunk, with its mixture of, as it's been said, high tech and low life. A genre that's given us not only a new aesthetic, but also a new way of looking at our relationship to technology. Gibson's also given us the term cyberspace. And that leads us to another vital thing that creative writing does well as research. It renovates and revitalizes our use of language. Ludwig Wittgenstein once wrote, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." Creative writing that innovates in terms of language has the potential to widen those limits, not just for everyone that reads it, but for a broader public. It's literature that has established for us the figure of the Pollyanna. It's thanks to a work of literature that we talk of utopias. Creative writers are storytellers, but they're also influential namers. And one other way in which creative writing can be valuable as research that I'll mention is in its imagining possible realities. Creative writing can serve as a kind of research and development lab, a very cost-effective one too, one that creates elaborate models in words, whether of new technologies or new societies. Obviously, science fiction is emblematic here. It was science fiction that first imagined everything from space travel and submarines to automatic doors. This is a kind of literature that spurs the imaginations of scientists and inventors. It also usefully can anticipate the consequences of new technologies, new kinds of societies. These are, of course, qualities for which many people have celebrated science fiction. A less often considered way in which science fiction can imagine new possibilities is through literary style. This possibility is one that was a focus of my research during my JHI fellowship, and it led to the publication of an article called Wondrous Portals, co-authored by David F. Shultz and me, that you can read through one of the links below. I got interested in this topic after I wrote a novel called A Suitable Companion for the End of Your Life. And in a certain sense, it's a science fiction novel, one in which I took up a different approach to style than I had in the past. This novel was published by Coach House Books last year. There's a link to it below as well. It's a novel in which the main character places an order on the internet. And the next day, not to her surprise, a box arrives on her doorstep. It includes the rolled up, flattened, still living body of a human being. Now, is this scientifically plausible? No. But the story takes place against the more plausible, more conventionally science fiction backdrop of a world gripped by, yes, a pandemic. And I actually finished writing this book before COVID-19 arrived, so it was, to say the least, uncanny to see parallels arise between what I'd imagined and what actually transpired. But to come back to style, in my previous two novels, I generally avoided anything showy in terms of style, that is, in terms of the writing sentence by sentence. If you were being uncharitable to me, you might even say that I was using what the critic James Wood has called commercial realism. James Wood describes commercial realism as artful but natural. He says that it involves such things as some telling detail, some good metaphor and simile, touches of reflection, confident generalizations by characters, and quite a bit, he says, of tight editing and careful omission. Things that he sees then as typical, even conventional in contemporary fiction. Well, as I was writing A Suitable Companion, I found myself playing with style as never before. I wrote every sentence carefully attending to sound and rhythms. I even invented new turns of phrase. One reason for this is that I was writing about a teenager in a version of reality that's like ours, but not quite the same, and I wanted to capture the vividness of young people's language while simultaneously evoking the strangeness of the world that I was creating. So recently, when for other reasons I became interested in minimalist approaches to literary style, I also became interested in looking at science fiction to see how writers in the genre might use style in interesting ways. I knew that speculative fiction has a reputation for largely being stylistically unremarkable, even dull. Its readers expect big ideas, not fancy sentences. But it seemed to me that at least some writers of science fiction might be drawn by their own speculative premises, as I had been, to approach style with an eye to innovation. Well, I'm not as well read in terms of science fiction as I'd like to be, so to investigate, I joined with someone who's well ensconced in the field. That's David F. Shultz, editor at the Toronto-based publisher T.Spec, and also editor of the magazine Speculative North. So together, David and I surveyed the field with an eye to what we call speculative style. That is, a style in science fiction that's experimental in ways that are tied to the narrative's speculative elements. Our work, as I mentioned, led to the publication in Tangent Online of an article, and I'd encourage you to read it if you'd like a fuller account of our findings. To round out this talk and to give you an indication of the article's argument, let me offer just 2 examples of speculative style. One is neologism, that is, the creation of new words. In fact, neologism is probably the most well-known way in which science fiction innovates stylistically. It's thanks to science fiction that English has gained terms such as space station, spacesuit, time machine, and webcast, to name just a few. And a second example of speculative style, a much more individuated one, is from a short story called Give Me English, published just last year by Toronto writer Jiang. If you like, you can read it through one of the links below by purchasing the issue of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction in which the story appears. This is a narrative featuring a version of our reality in which words are a literal currency. They're housed in each individual's mental lang base, as it's called in the story. And these words can be traded for other goods, which leaves people with enriched or depleted vocabularies. Throughout the narrative, words that are missing from the protagonist's lexicon appear on the page as blanks, as in this message that she receives from her friend. "Oh, you mean L's blank, or L blanks C blank," he says. "The selections there are M blank. I cannot F blank purchasing C blank elsewhere." So this is really remarkable. Like the protagonist with her limited lang base, we as readers are put in the position of wanting to decipher these sentences. But at the same time, Jiang's technique gives the story the quality of erasure poetry, insisting that words on a page are always haunted by what's been said before, what can't be said, what one refuses to say. It's really unique prose that expands our appreciation of fiction's stylistic capacities. So it's in this kind of work that we can see creative writing as undertaking a form of research. Now, I'm by no means claiming that all creative writing makes a research contribution, but in recognizing that creative writing's research affordances are there, we can better identify the value of what such writing can do with respect to the work of the university in advancing knowledge and understanding. Thanks very much for listening today. Thanks to the Jackman Humanities Institute for its fantastic support of humanities research and research creation.